Some years ago, I was working for a well-known consumer electronics manufacturer. You'll know the name, but I won't mention who it was. They were selling a product that was being manufactured abroad, and the case was made using a process called plastic injection molding. Now, how this process works isn't so important, but suffice it to say that a steel mold is made, and the mold is filled with liquid plastic, and when the plastic cools, a complex electronic case is produced. The molds are pretty difficult to make. They cost about $40,000 each and are largely made by hand. And because the tolerance of the plastic cases were so tight, each of the molds could only be used about 20,000 times before it needed to be replaced. Inside each of the molds were registration marks that identified the mold and also allowed the QA department to test the manufacturing process and make sure that the tolerances were being met. Now, not long after starting production, I got a call from my client saying that they'd gotten word that counterfeits were being imported at the Port of Los Angeles. So I flew down to Los Angeles and went shopping in the electronics district and soon found counterfeit copies of my client's product. When we disassembled the product and took the cases off, although the insides were completely different, the cases were exact copies of my client's products. In fact, the cases contained the registration marks in the molds of the originally manufactured product. My client's expensive and life-limited molds had themselves been used to manufacture the counterfeits. It was clear that the factory itself had colluded in these counterfeits. This was an inside job. Now, there are 4 ways where this inside manufacturing theft usually occurs. The first is that the CAD files or the blueprints of the molds are copied and sold off to a third party by someone in the factory. The second technique that we commonly see in counterfeiting is that the exhausted molds are then sold to a third party to use in building counterfeits. Now, I mentioned that these molds were good for making about 20,000 units. So what typically happens in this scenario is that the manufacturer takes those exhausted molds, sells them to a third party, and allows the third party to make additional units from those exhausted molds. So this hurts in 2 ways. The first is that there are counterfeit parts that are being made and sold. And the second is that the counterfeit parts are likely of lower quality. They have worse tolerances and are more prone to defects. This creates confusion in the marketplace as to the quality of the original manufacturer's goods. Now, a third way in which a factory can steal from an original manufacturer is to circumvent the original manufacturer and sell parts directly to a third-party distributor. For example, sellers on Amazon. And I know this all too often happens because the Amazon sellers then contact me and say, John, I've been kicked off the Amazon marketplace because I've been accused of patent infringement from an original equipment manufacturer. I had no idea there was a patent. I was just selling product that was being advertised for sale by a factory. Now, getting back to my client, we hired a private investigator in the country in which the factory was located. And we found a 4th technique was being used in the theft and counterfeiting of my client's product. My client had originally purchased 12 injection molds. 8 of them were being used on the manufacturing line. 4 of them were being held in reserve as spares. Well, remember the registration numbers? With the help of a private investigator, we determined that 2 of the 4 spares had been loaned or leased to a nearby factory who was producing the counterfeits. And as you might imagine, a spirited legal discussion with the factory quickly followed once we found this information out. So what can you do when outsourcing your manufacturing to help protect your intellectual property and to avoid counterfeiting? Most importantly, work with reputable factories, companies that you feel good about doing business with and who have strong reputations in your industry. Ideally, you'd like to have someone on site at the factory monitoring your production, auditing the use of your tooling and your equipment. This isn't always possible, however, in today's global manufacturing world. Keep track as best you can of manufacturing tooling and tie the units produced to the life expectancy of the tool. And make sure that once a tool reaches end of life, that it's properly and verifiably destroyed. It's super important to be vigilant of counterfeiting. Keep an eye out for counterfeits of your product that might be showing up in the marketplace. And finally, good contracts. So-called NNN agreements are very common overseas and in China. And by the way, these NNN or triple N agreements are not to be confused with the triple net agreements that we often see in leasing real property. NNN, with respect to foreign manufacturing, refers to non-disclosure, non-use, and non-circumvention. We're familiar with the non-disclosure terms in triple N agreements because these are similar to the terms that we find in the more common non-disclosure agreements. In other words, we agree as a matter of contract to keep each other's secrets. Non-use in a triple N agreement refer to the agreement that the factory will not use any information or tooling except for your benefit. And the non-circumvention clause prevents the factory from going around you, either directly to your distributors or selling directly to your customers. As I mentioned, these NNN or triple N agreements are very common in China and other foreign countries. It's important, however, to understand that these agreements are jurisdictionally dependent. It can be very helpful to get legal input from lawyers who are located in the jurisdiction of the factory. Your U.S. attorney should be able to make those contacts and get that input for you. Okay, that's really all I have to say today about triple N agreements and working with foreign factories. If you found this video interesting, I think you'll find this next video useful as well. I'll see you over there.